and we are seeing our participant numbers rising. And now it is time to start drinking because it is Friday.
Exactly.
It is very Friday.
I think the best thing about drinking with historians is that since I'm on the West Coast, I get to like enjoy a proper happy hour, like a real happy hour, because it's 3 p.m. here, and I get to be done with like 2 ounces by the time it's 4, and I'm like, damn, this is a good weekend. So speaking of that, we're now in double digits. It's like the 10th webinar we've done, and today we have Anne. I'm gonna pronounce your name incorrectly. Anne Thériault. Thériault.
There we go. Excellent.
Ontario, like Ontario.
Nice.
And Ontario.
And I'm in Ontario.
Yeah. Okay.
Nice. And I think we'll just start with what's everyone drinking. I'm having Hudson Whiskey Baby Bourbon again, and it's very good.
I have a fancy gin.
Okay.
Called the Botanist, and
ooh.
I have like a fancy pink tonic water that says it's aromatic. I don't really know what that means, but I like it. So that's what I'm drinking.
Yeah, I've always found gin and tonics to be very fancy drinks. Like they're just too elevated for me.
Yeah, that was like when I was younger, especially. Like it seemed like it was so refined. Like I would never be that cultured, right, to drink those things. So, and having said that, I've made a fancy cocktail because that's just how I roll in Appalachia as a professor of the humanities. I have made this lovely drink called a Bijou. I knew that Anne was going to drink gin because I remember you tweeting about that. And so it's a gin-based cocktail, which also has some sweet vermouth and some green chartreuse, which is very herbal. So, so it kind of enhances the gin flavor, but it has this kind of lovely kind of color as well. And it's just, it's very refreshing because it is like 90% humidity outside for some reason. And man, did I need this because, yeah, it was terrible. So, anyway, so thank you again, and thank you so much, Anne, for joining us. You know, I hesitate to ask you about this, but because one of the things I think a lot of our viewers will know you from is from your wonderful Queens of Infamy series on long reads, and since demon sex is in the news, I think I have to do that because I know there have been a lot of stories about, or a lot of charges perhaps levied at queens in the past, like. Any stories about queens having sex with demons in the past that you can think of? Any great salacious kind of sex stories that you want to share with us?
I can't think of any like with demons, but well, no, I guess like Anne Boleyn had some pretty serious like witchcraft, sorcery charges laid against her.
Okay.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah, Henry VIII said that she had like ensorcelled him, and I think he might have also either implied or said that she like made his dick soft and like and her final miscarriage, there was something wrong with the fetus, but it was kind of there, or according to some people it was like a monstrous fetus. There were clearly some kind of like abnormalities, and that was like proof that it had been conceived not with Henry or like with dark magic or something.
Yeah. Did he use this as justification to behead her later on? Was this like
yeah, well, this was like all, this was like this was during her trial, and she was, I might be getting things wrong because it's been a while since I've read about her, but she was, tried for treason, and also was accused of like incest with her brother, and like, he said she slept with like a lot of people. It was like a whole,
So was it kind of the throw everything at the wall divorce proceedings in order to get her? It's like, and in some ways, I mean, this seems very typical for some of the medieval kings and queens that I've read, right? Like incest, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, right? Like,
yes.
Accused of incest later on, kind of like not witchcraft, but some sort of dark arts suggestion, kind of to her and stuff like that. I mean, does that seem kind of a common trope? I mean, in the queens that you've written about specifically?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like, there's so much skepticism about women's sexuality and kind of so much fear and weirdness tied up in that. And And I think also too with Anne and Eleanor, there was definitely like an element of foreignness that, you know, Eleanor was from Aquitaine, and these accusations later came out in England, and Anne had been educated at the French court. So there was kind of this like, you know, deeply English suspicion of French things.
Yeah.
Or,
So just like the English say, like when anything has any like seasoning or anything, it's like witchcraft, right? So it has to be terrible. Sorry, that's unfair, but yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. But how did you start, like, how did you decide to start studying queens, and how did you start the series on long reads to start looking at infamous queens?
Well, I mean, I've always really been into history, and it just kind of started as a joke that I was tweeting these silly joke tweets of like funny imagined dialogues. I think the first one was Mary Queen of Scots being like, oh yeah, weird, my husband like died in an explosion, my terrible husband, I for sure didn't murder him. And so my now editor at Long Reads, who I didn't know at the time, and he messaged me and he was like, hey, these are very funny, we're looking for more content for Long Reads, would you be interested, or would you be able to like turn them into like a 3,000 to 5,000 word essay? And I was like, absolutely not. And then I was like, well, we can just try it. Like, I'll try it and we'll see what happens. And it just, I don't know, it was magic. It just kind of all coalesced and came together. And I'm still astounded that people like it, because it feels like such a weird private in-joke.
Well, that's the thing about Twitter too, which you know, despite there are many flaws with Twitter, but you know, it can be good in many ways. Is that these in jokes become kind of community jokes, right?
Yeah.
That, or at least the in group can expand very quickly. I mean, the Twitter storying community, people who are interested in history, kind of generally, is really enormous, and I think that's testified not just to, you know, something like this webinar that we're trying to do, but like, you know, like you just said, like your series and things like that. So, are there any like queens that you haven't written about, or you feel you can't write about that you want to write about, or anybody that you just can't get a handle on in order to write about yet?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's some of the really big ones that kind of they're so infamous that I'm like, there's almost no point in writing about them, because like Marie Antoinette, I feel like I could never do, because her story is so big and it's so famous, and there would just be too much information to put in. But I mean, who knows? I really like the French queens. So.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Who's your least favorite queen? Since you said you like French queens, who's the worst?
Oh, of French queens? I don't know. Of English queens, I would say Jane Seymour I really hate.
Okay.
Wait, why Jane Seymour? What does she do?
Oh, I just feel like she was so like pious and annoying, and like, well, she just kind of comes off smelling like a rose, because she like married Henry, like immediately gave birth to a son, and then died, which is like a power move, like. And she kind of like, she's remembered as being, you know, the really like milk-fed, pious, good alternative after Anne Boleyn, but like, and I think like each of Henry's wives were uniquely the victims of his shit. But you know, in many ways, Jane was complicit-ish in what happened to Anne, in that she was already engaged in a deep flirtation with Henry when he decided that he needed to get out of his marriage with Anne. And like, you know, that's unfair, because like, again, he was the one with all the power, and if you're like a very young woman at his court and he starts flirting with you, like, of course you kind of have to go along with it. So it's totally unfair to her. I don't like her.
I mean, we're several hundred years beyond that. I mean, you could like her safely from here. Yeah. So I guess the natural question after that would, at least for me, would be like, so what's the flip side of that? Like, you know, they start making movies again. The head of a studio comes to you and says, "Anne, we're going to make a movie of your favorite queen. Who is it?"
Joanna of Naples.
Joanna of Naples. All right, you had that question. You had that answer ready.
I know nothing about her.
I don't
so
know anything about Joanna of Naples. Tell me about Joanna of Naples.
Oh, so she had such a bonkers story. So she became queen in kind of the mid I guess 1300s, and she became Queen of Naples, and she was very young, and she was forced to marry her very annoying younger cousin, and she very like outwardly loathed him, and they were like 16 and 14, I think, like they were quite young, and she had a baby with him, and then he was horrifically murdered, and it looked quite suspicious for her because right before he was murdered, she'd like gone into her chambers and like locked the door from the inside so that he couldn't get in, and then like some messenger came and was like, hey, we've got a message for you, and then they hung him from a balcony.
Wow.
And
You're right. It doesn't look good for her.
no.
So.
It does. It's yeah, and of course, like she's a woman, so they're immediately suspicious of her. She's a woman who has a lot of power, and also she immediately then marries her hot cousin that she's had a crush on, who is not related to the first cousin. They're opposite branches, and then so she's pregnant with the hot cousin's baby. And the Hungarians, who are from her first husband, they're like trying to invade Naples because they're like, we're pretty sure you murdered him. And then the Black Plague comes to Naples.
Convenient timing. Yeah.
Everyone's fucking dying. And Joanna has to like escape, and she flees in the middle of the night to Avignon to go see the Pope, because she's like, the Pope can exonerate me. And so she gets to Avignon, the plague is also there, and like people are like dropping dead in the streets, and she does this giant procession through Avignon. She's had the baby by this point, and she's this beautiful young blonde woman. She's like, I don't think she's not even 20 yet, and she's like dressed to the nines, has this procession through Avignon, gets to the Pope, and she's like, I think we all know that I'm innocent of my murdering my husband, because if I was guilty, God would have given me the plague, because I just like walked through your plague city and I'm healthy, so I think we can all agree that I didn't do anything. And the Pope is like, yeah, true, you're very hot, that's fair. and she had many, she was married twice more after that, and ended up and then the Great Western Schism happened, and she was involved in that, and then she was like murdered at the end of her life, and her body was thrown down a well. Like, it's just drama.
I think that's what's really like bananas about queens in general, is that like they have so much power, but at the same time they're still like inflicted by the forces of misogyny. Mm-hmm. So like whatever I know about Elizabeth I, right, is that like, you know, she's like this powerful queen, Spanish Armada, all that stuff. But also at the same time, all of her advisors are like, why doesn't this person goddamn like marry someone? Blah, blah, blah. So I think I binged all of The Crown. And so like, obviously I'm not like a fan of the British monarchy or anything, unlike some people on the internet who are obsessed with it. But Elizabeth's like Elizabeth II's story is pretty bananas. Like it's pretty wild. Yeah. Like the level of like distrust a lot of the prime ministers in Britain like have of the Queen and the monarchy, but at the same time are deeply conservative and like don't want to offend her at all. But she has absolutely like no power. So like that's what like I find fascinating about queens, specifically British queens, is that for like most of what we say like the 19th century onwards, they don't really have that much power. Yeah. So it's just it's weird. I don't know. Do you find it weird studying the monarchy after, at least British queens, after a certain period when you realize they don't really hold that much sway as they did in earlier decades or earlier centuries?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know as much about. I mean, I've also watched The Crown, and I guess like I live in Canada, so Elizabeth's like on my money and stuff. She's my queen. But I don't know as much. But yeah, it is really interesting, and I do find that kind of tension between like these women who hold so much symbolic power, and often through history very real power, but also, like you said, are very much subject to the forces of misogyny, and watching how they kind of navigate that like soft power or whatever you want to call it is really interesting.
Yeah, that's a really critical and I think a really interesting point, right? Is that, like, as Varsha was saying, and then you were saying too, is that you know even when Joanna, for example, like in the 14th century, right? Like Joanna, when her husband dies, like that puts her in a really precarious position. She's a queen, but she's still like she needs to kind of remarry, right? There's very few instances, at least from the medieval period that I'm familiar with, in which women are just able to kind of exist without at least seeking a marriage, or at least pretending that they're seeking a marriage. Like Elizabeth becomes this kind of, I mean, she's singular in some ways, Elizabeth I, because she doesn't do that. So I mean, so when you're kind of talking about queens, I mean, I guess there's kind of two questions that are kind of rumbling around in my mind, and I could tell that the drink is starting to affect me because they're not working out themselves yet. Is there a particular period in which that's not true, or is that true like even from the medieval period into today? In the queens that you've been particularly interested in, and I guess kind of related to that is are there queens that kind of successfully navigate that better than others? So
yeah, I mean, I think we would like to think it's not true up until even today that like a queen wouldn't have to marry, but I think even still we are deeply suspicious of a woman with power who is not married, and like Elizabeth married very young, and and even I mean, Kate Middleton wasn't born a royal, but watching her be integrated into the royal family, and how she's had to kind of shrink herself to become like this kind of perfect facade of like never showing any emotion and always being ready to be photographed like 24 hours after giving birth, and really there still isn't I guess much room for women who don't break the mold, even still, I would say. And I'm not an expert, but women from history who have broken the mold. I mean, like Eleanor of Aquitaine is a big example because she like led a rebellion against her husband.
Didn't work out so great, but still. Yeah.
And her second husband, I love so many things about Eleanor of Aquitaine. Maybe one of the things I love is like that she's married to Louis. She's Queen of France. She meets the future Henry II of England, who at that point is like 17, and she's like I think 28.
Yeah.
And he's like, babe, run away to England with me. Like, divorce your snooze of a husband. Like, let's go. She's like, cool.
Yeah.
Oh. I mean, I think he was 18 when they actually married. Not that makes it much better, but it is like, it's dicey.
There was an age difference, and I mean, like that's a fascinating thing about Eleanor too, right? It's like she's always older than the people she's with, right? Like, so she's like, and she's savvy. Like, I mean, she doesn't always get what she's trying to get, but yeah, she's very smart. So.
I think the question that I've always had is, I don't know if you had to do this when you were researching for the Josephine pieces, but I've actually never, I think I read the love letters that Napoleon wrote her like ages ago back in high school. I read like translated versions, but I guess the question I have is from Josephine's story, right? Napoleon's wife, what's your like perspective on queens who basically marry into queendom? Like, are they inherently different than the ones who have like who become queens through birth? And how does that like work in when they have to deal with living their lives? Do you see like a different story for them? I think like a present day example would be Kate Middleton, right? Like, I know she's not a queen, but like marrying into royalty, like you can have like two versions of that, right? You can either be Kate Middleton, everyone's like perfect princess, or you can be what Britain considers Meghan Markle, like the black sheep of daughter-in-laws, which is so frustrating. But very true. It's like, do you see that with like historical examples like Josephine?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Josephine's story is interesting to me in so many ways. I think, yeah, women like her, that unlike Eleanor of Aquitaine, they weren't raised with kind of all that education and the assumption that they would wield some kind of power, that, like, you know, Josephine was very uneducated and very gauche. Like, she came from the colonies. She you know, had been like kind of a sex worker. Like, she had a very scandalous past, and she was like still sleeping with other people after she married Napoleon.
And I think like he knew, right? And it just, he was like, he couldn't do anything. He just kept loving her until he died. It's very sad.
Yeah. I mean, they did divorce, but I think that was mostly because she couldn't give him an heir. I mean, he did have a big, there, I mean, it was a whole kind of scandal when the story broke about her having this affair, because what had happened was he'd found out, and he was in Egypt at the time, and he wrote this like extremely heartbroken letter being like, I'm gonna divorce her, it's so awful, blah blah blah. And then the ship this letter was on got caught by the British, and they leaked the letter to the press and printed it in the newspaper because they were like, wow, like,
Female Napoleon.
yeah, like,
yeah.
Damn, that's like leaking like your DMs, but like 19th century. Oh, that, I'm sorry, like that's harsh. And then he divorces her right after, or does he just like stay married to her?
Wow. No, so he goes home and he's like, I'm gonna divorce you. And then she's like crying, and she's like, no, don't divorce me, whatever. And he's like, no, I'm gonna divorce you. And then she like goes, so she has 2 children by her first husband, who was killed in the Reign of Terror. And so she goes and gets her kids and tells them to cry and beg to him not to leave her. And they're like tweens or teens at this time. And so they're like, please don't leave. Like, our mom will have no money, and then we'll be so poor and it'll be terrible. And so then he's like, oh, like, I just love these children so much. Like, I guess I'll stay. And then like he and Josephine go and have sex. And then it was right after that the kind of coup happened when he became like the first consul, and she was quite instrumental in kind of the back channeling that. I mean, she was a good complement to her in the sense that like he had no emotional intelligence. He was good at military stuff, but like bad at negotiating, and she was very good at kind of convincing powerful men to do what she wanted.
Yeah, I think that's sort of what you see with like queens who, you know, have to support kings, is that they're the ones who are doing a lot of the politicking, and they're like erased a lot from history, and they have to like actually look at their diaries and their notes and their writings to see like them get any of the credit for the work they've done. Because like that's sort of what I know about Josephine, is that like in the background, like not only was she cheating on Napoleon, she also was like a big deal, and I forgot it first.
So I guess, I mean, if I can follow up on that, I think, you know, one of the things that we asked a lot of our previous guests is like, so what got you interested in this? I mean, like, you know, there's, you know, you talked about kind of how the Queens of Infamy kind of started, but like, you know, history isn't for everyone. I mean, that's ridiculous. I know that's a statement to say, but at the same time, it is actually true. So what kind of got you interested in Queens kind of generally, but just kind of the study of the past kind of in particular?
When I was little, one of my mom's friends gave me a bunch of old books, and in the pile was a bunch of books by Rosemary Sutcliffe, who was like a century British children's author, and or like YA, I guess. And she wrote historical stories about like almost every period in British history, I would say, like from the Bronze Age right up until like pretty recent history, and all of the protagonists were kids, and they were often like sometimes young women, or like Rosemary Sutcliffe was disabled, so often there was like an element of disability, and I was just so hooked by all of these stories that she just like made it come alive and seem so fascinating. And I've reread them, and they seem like the language is a bit dated now, but I just like loved these books as a kid, and often they were just kind of like very, like, they weren't about like famous people or even big events. They were just kind of like a day in the life of someone. There was the first one I read was like the main protagonist was named Tamsin, and she was an 11-year-old girl living in Tudor England and just kind of doing regular things, but it was the regular things that I really loved.
That's really interesting, because I mean, like, I don't think of kind of the story of queens as the same as kind of the story of everyday life. Mm-hmm. Right. So those are kind of a different thing. So I mean, like, so is that, do you see that as a separation, or do you see that in some way kind of connected or just about kind of like telling a fuller story of the past kind of generally in kind of the work that you do, the writing that you do generally?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think I like the like scandalous big elements of queens, but I really enjoy the just kind of everyday elements of what life was like what they were wearing, what they were eating, what the gossip was, that I really enjoy, like the social history.
Yeah, we tend to, I think we talked about this before, on episodes, is that a lot of our students, who come to this, or a lot of kind of general people who like to think about the past in black and white, and this is kind of a terrible metaphor, but these were like human beings who existed in the past, right? Like they cared about things, they loved things, they disliked things, they gossiped, they said scandalous things and stuff like that. And I think, anything that can kind of revive that and kind of in bring the past into full color, I think is incredibly important in a lot of ways. So.
Yeah, and it's important in like any type of political history. So like, when I do diplomatic history, or technically I'm like, my subfield is US foreign relations, and so usually my historical subjects for a lot of people in my fields are like old white guys, but maybe not old white guys, but at the very least old men. They might not be white. And so generally what you're focused on is their political decisions, and you sort of like, in the process, a lot of older books on diplomatic history sort of end up taking the humanity out of these decisions and out of these stories. And I think the shift that you see in like recent historiography of like diplomatic history, especially if you're looking at anything from like post 1945 onwards, you see like historians attempting to inject the humanity back into it, especially if you're looking at decision making. I think a really great example is recent work that's been done on William McKinley and his decision to enter the Spanish-American War. We know a lot more now, or at least we are focusing a lot more now on his like internal thinking and like actually who influenced him on his like his internal struggle with like having to declare the war. And I think that adds a lot more than just saying, oh, he declared the war because of X, Y, and Z reasons and these advisors helped him. I think the same goes for like queens, right? You don't just assume that because they have all this power, we're able to take the humanity away from it and the story is going to be, useful.
Yeah, I think often in kind of like an attempt to, I don't know, make history feel like formal and academic and serious, that a lot of the stuff that would interest people gets pulled out of it. And that's why I feel like so often, you kind of hear people be like, oh, I don't know, I never liked history. It was very boring. It was just a lot of dates, and names of battles. And that makes me so sad because to me, history is the most interesting thing.
Yeah, I think right. It has to really do with how you teach history, because I feel like if you spent your high school years reading Queens of Infamy as well as like treating history like a story, you come out with a much more appreciation for it. Like my 7th grade teacher is like one of the reasons I jumped into it. Her name was Miss Zuli, and I remember now we were going over the Reformation. And back then I was like, 12, 13. I didn't understand Christianity. For the longest time, I did not understand Christianity, nor did I understand the Reformation. And I remember her going
Varsha,
over
can I just interrupt to say that those of us who study Christianity still don't fundamentally understand Christianity.
I did not understand it. And so I remember she went over the fact like Martin Luther did 95 Theses, and she ends in a cliffhanger. Every class she'd end in a cliffhanger, and we'd have to go to lunch and then next period. And at the end of every class, I'd be like, what happens next, Miss Uli? I need to know. I don't understand. Like, does the Pope, like, what happens? And she's like, you have to wait till next time.
Yeah.
And I think that's what got me into it, is like reading it like a story and like treating it as if like the cliffhangers are the best part about it, even though they're so frustrating. And that's sort of what I get from Queens of Infamy, right? That's what I get from biographies, is like you get the human part of it. Like when we were talking to Joanne Freeman, that's what I love most about the musical Hamilton. Even though I know Alexander Hamilton in real life was a huge jackass and he like sucked and was a monarchist, I love the musical because, you know, Sorry, we'll go into Q&A now.
Well, I think, I mean, like, if I could just add something really quickly and ask Anne about this, is that because I think that Varsha, you bring up an incredibly interesting point, is that, you know, it's not just teaching. Like we tend to think sometimes as historians, like most teaching happens in a classroom, right? Like somebody's standing in front of somebody, like a bunch of younger people, and they're teaching them. But I think that teaching happens in a lot of different ways. It happens like on Twitter. It happens by reading something like Queens of Infamy or other kind of popular things and stuff like that. But also like with movies and TV shows. So I wanted to ask you, Anne, like, do you have kind of a favorite piece, or maybe like favorite in that you hate it so much that you kind of love it, a piece of pop culture that kind of deals with stuff that you're interested in about Queens or something else that kind of embraces or kind of gets at the past in a way?
There was...
Are you going to say the Tudors?
No. No.
Okay.
It's actually worse. But it's the first thing I thought of. There was a short-lived, deeply wonderful ahistorical show called Reign, R-E-I-G-N.
I know this, on the CW, right? And it was very bad.
But you know what? Every episode passed the Bechdel test. But it's supposed to be about a young Mary Queen of Scots living in the French court with Catherine de Medici, who is played by the amazing Megan, what's her name, who played Anne of Green Gables. And it was like,
I do not know. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It's a very Canadian thing. It was filmed in Canada.
So it was Canadian and Queens and cheesy, so like perfection.
Yeah. My friend was a dialect coach on it, and
really?
She's British, because of course they had everyone speak with British English accents, even though half the characters are Scottish and half of them are French.
I think that's like the weirdest thing about pop culture, about anything before 1945, is that for some reason every pop culture representation has to be them being British accents, and I'm like, this is set in Italy though. I don't know.
The insistence on British accents or English accents is kind of old timey, right? It's just so weird.
Yeah, and it's interesting. And then, did you guys ever watch Chernobyl? Actually, there's a historical show that was actually good, that I really liked. But Americans were very weirded out that people had British accents, even though it was a British production. And it's so interesting. And they were like, why didn't they do Russian accents? I'm like, well, that would have been so bad though. Like, none of the actors are Russian.
Yeah.
But I find accents are the way they're used in media is so interesting, because they were just so often used to denote foreignness or not foreignness. But then to kind of Canadians and Americans, British does sound foreign to us.
Yeah, and fancy and old-timey, right? Like I am imagining right now, like Chernobyl in Russian accents, which it would have been so terrible. Like, can you imagine? Oh my God! Like it would have been so terrible, like unwatchable. So
I think a really an example from India that like I'm sure neither of you guys have watched, but maybe a few of our viewers have. It's deeply ahistorical. My South Asian history professor hates it. and he studies the Mughal period. It's called Jodha Akbar, and it's the story, the fictionalized story of Akbar the Great, who's a Mughal emperor,
Oh, really?
one of the first Mughal emperors, and Jodha, who's a Hindu princess from like a certain state in India. And technically, the real historical story is like Akbar marries a bunch of Hindu princesses, Indian princesses across the continent in order to consolidate power, right? Like he has multiple wives. Him and Jodha are never deeply in love or anything. But this Bollywood movie, because it is Bollywood, is like set with Aishwarya Rai, who's like gorgeous, and Hrithik Roshan, who's also like incredibly hunky, and like I think the best part about this pop culture representation is how similar it is to how a lot of people think about English kings. Like when I watched The Tudors, I am sad to say in high school I was obsessed with The Tudors. I really thought I was going to become a scholar of either the French Revolution or Henry VIII just because of that show. And it was deeply embarrassing. But the reason that these shows are just so fascinating, I would say, is like historical objects, is because the story of that movie is very nationalistic. Like the one of the big turning points is when Akbar decides, I'm going to end the tax for Hindus going to pilgrimage because he's a Muslim king, right? And that obviously that is a big deal in historical record, but that it's highlighted in this movie is like a big aspect of like the nationalistic bent of a lot of Bollywood movies. And this is true of a lot of other Bollywood movies that are historical in fashion. They're deeply focused on like Hindu tradition and like this ancient stuff. Like there is a movie called Ashoka, which is about Ashoka the Great. So I find this is like very similar to how Americans and Canadians and British people do movies about their royalty as well. Like The Crown is deeply nationalistic. Like obviously it's flawed, in the sense that like it points out the flaws of all these royals and all this stuff and the scandals and stuff, but it's also deeply like rah Great Britain, and I think that's what I find hilarious about it. Yeah.
And our crush
Q&A.
Prince Charles.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Matt Smith was like the best actor in that show besides like the actual queen. Like I was like, damn, that is exactly how scandalous Prince Philip really is. Yeah. Okay, questions.
So we should take. We have a ton of really interesting questions from the audience here. So I think we should get to those instead of just kind of fangirling about our favorite videos. So, no, I mean it is our show. I mean we could just do that if we wanted to. I mean it's fine. But anyway, so Anne, one of the questions I think that was very interesting that somebody asked was about kind of how do we take historical lessons into the present. Right, so we were talking earlier about kind of historical queens and how women kind of need to navigate power in different ways, in which we still, they're not necessarily kind of given power. There's certain assumptions about them, right, and they need to kind of work within this specifically kind of frankly misogynistic framework. So, do you see anything like in your Queens of Infamy series or any kind of other reading or writing that you've done about like are there kind of lessons for today, or is that not something that you're particularly interested in? Or
no, I think for sure. I mean, I think one of the inspirations, if that's the right word, for the series was after the 2016 election, when there had been kind of this narrative that I saw over and over on social media that like it would be so historical to have a woman president, it would be unprecedented, it would be like groundbreaking, and like obviously that's true for America, but there have been so many women leaders throughout history, good and bad, and it felt like it feels like, how do you learn from the past if you're kind of erasing the past to create this narrative of exceptionalism? And I do think there is a lot to be learned about how we view women and power when we look at these historical queens. Sorry, I'm getting a little drunk, so I feel like I'm rambling.
No, that works.
So I think when we can create a better narrative, when we're more aware of kind of like the breadth of women who have exercised power.
Definitely. I think that's a frustrating thing about being an Americanist or being from America, is that I think the American exceptionalism is like so deeply ingrained in us from day one, no matter how much we try to escape it. And so I think that's a really good point, is that technically electing Hillary Clinton would not have been the most revolutionary thing to ever happen in the world, considering that many countries have had female prime ministers way before.
Wait, there are other countries?
Yeah.
What? Sorry.
Someone asks, do you have any plans, or are you interested in looking at queens from Asia or like the non-Western world? And have you before? And what do you see any major differences in how they're portrayed or how you studied them than queens from the Western world?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely like, it's not as much in my wheelhouse, so I don't feel as comfortable because I don't know. I don't have kind of the cultural context. That's why I feel very comfortable with English and French queens, because I'm like, I understand both those cultural contexts. We have done, so we did Zenobia, who was Queen of Syria, and we've done Mariamne, who was Queen of Judea, and we also did Jinga, who was a Queen of Angola. So we do try. They don't, like I said, I don't have the cultural context, so it is trickier. But yeah, I do find those narratives and lives fascinating, even much more fascinating because they do often have like a very different gender context for women and leadership, and I have to move so far outside my own box of understanding in order to kind of figure out how to tell those stories and how to tell those stories in an appropriate way as a white woman.
Go ahead, Varsha. Sorry.
Oh no, I didn't have. There was a question about current politicians. So basically, like we had a couple of questions about like, do you think, are there any current politicians, maybe not in the United States or like across the world, you could point out that you think are interesting to study as queens? Like somebody asked, how would you study Melania Trump as a queen? Or if not Melania Trump, somebody else, right? Like, is there, do you see examples of like treating not just celebrities, but politicians as like royalty, as we sort of have, and as people do treat royalty in other countries? That's sort of like the gist of the questions that we got about politicians and queens.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is definitely, to me, a very weird kind of stan culture of politicians that we did see for sure with Hillary Clinton. And like, I don't wish to speak ill of her, and obviously she would have been a much better choice than Trump, but she was also like had some deeply problematic elements that kind of got erased. But it feels like in these kind of cultures of supporting politicians that if you support them, you have to, it's almost like you can't talk about the problematic parts. Like, I think there will be some very interesting histories written about Angela Merkel, who has had some very high highs and some very low lows. But is, I think, a fascinating example of a woman navigating power on kind of a international stage.
Definitely. And I think like the British example for me, when Theresa May was elected, and then like a few months into her premiership, I saw a lot of people online, conservative and liberal, like British people, comparing her to Margaret Thatcher. And I got thinking back to like my experience studying Thatcher in undergrad, and like how a lot of the misogyny that was directed against Thatcher, even though Thatcher was a horrible prime minister, is like sort of erased because of how horrible Thatcher was politically, right? And I think that's very similar to how people treat female politicians today in the United States. You're either like fully in support of them, you're erasing anything bad about them, or you're like tweeting out snake emojis because that's the kind of human you are. And so I think that's sort of what the question was getting at, is that they're deeply, even though we don't have a monarchy in this country, there are people we have elevated to royal status, be that politicians or people like Kim Kardashian, right? So.
And I think that's like one of the things I try to do with Queens of Infamy, and something I think is so important is when we talk especially about women, or especially about any marginalized person, that it has to be a nuanced conversation, and we have to allow for like the whole breadth of humanity, that they have failings as well as really positive stuff, and we're not going to have a fair conversation about women as long as it's kind of focused on this like kick-ass girls, this woman is like a badass.
No, the day we created the term girl boss was like the fall of humanity. Like, I swear to God.
Should I start playing the song Fight Song right now?
Yeah, that's the song I'm gonna play.
Would that be good? Yeah. Kind of following up on that, somebody asked, one of the things I think that a lot of people think who don't necessarily do a lot with history, but maybe consume, I should say, history rather than kind of produce works of history, is they think that you have to have some sort of kind of attachment to the people you study. And like, as someone who studies the Crusades, like, I hate all those sons of bitches, right? Like, they were terrible fucking human beings. Like, I find them really interesting, which is a different thing than liking them, but I find them really interesting. So one of the questions was like, so if you took over, like, if you did a drinking with queens kind of webinar or something like that, like, who would be your first guess, and like, what would you want to ask them? Like, if you could ask, and if you could, Joanna of Naples, for example, like, or you could pick somebody else, like, what would you want to ask them?
Oh, I don't know. I guess I'd want to ask, like, I mean, I just want to know all the like silly details, like I said, about life, but I'd want to ask like how lonely it must be to have all these people who fakely want to be your friend but also want to betray you, like, very lonely at the top, I feel.
Yeah, like, how do you deal with the loneliness of being a queen? Because at the same time, like, you're surrounded by everyone all the time, but you're deeply I think that that's definitely one of the themes of The Crown, and like anything else I've read about royalty, is that it's very lonely. But like, no one has pity for you because you have all the power.
Well, and again, like, I mean, like creating these people as three-dimensional, right? Like these people had feelings, right? Like, what must it have been like to walk through the streets of Avignon, like knowing the stakes of what's going on, and also the fact that there's fucking plague everywhere. So
the river is
gotta do that.
Bodies.
Yes. Another person asked if I can just follow up on that, is that like, so who would be, of all the queens that you've written about, like not including all the queens you kind of want to write about, but of all the queens you've written about, who would be the best on Twitter?
I feel like Anne Boleyn would probably be like the spiciest.
Okay.
I feel like most of them would be canceled immediately. Like,
definitely. Cancel culture is rampant among the monarchy.
They would like, tweet something super problematic, and people would be like, Catherine de Medici, she's over.
She's canceled immediately.
Amper.
I like, building on that, somebody else asked, like, what queen that you've written about do you think wielded like the most hard power, and like how was she able to do that? Do you think there's like a single example that stands out?
Both Zenobia and Nzinga would be the two. Zenobia I find really fascinating because I love the ancient Romans, and I love how they're kind of like the perfect villain and foil in any story, because they're so terrible, and it's not like you're like offending anyone when you're like, the ancient Romans were super shitty.
That is a truth universally acknowledged.
Yeah.
Yes.
And like, the only people you're offending are like white nationalists who are like, Roman.
Even modern day Romans are like,
yeah, we suck, whatever. Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
Canceled by Romans. But yeah, I find Zenobia really interesting because we don't know like a whole lot about her, but what we do know is that she was married to a king in Palmyra. I think that's how Palmyra. I've only ever read it, so I don't know how to say it. She was married to the king. She had accompanied him like quite frequently on in battle and stuff, and he died, and she was just like, whatever, I'm the queen now. And then she was like, also, we're gonna take on the Roman Empire and just like start annexing territory. So she took over like Arabia, a chunk of Turkey. She managed to take over Egypt and held it for a couple of years against the Romans, and she was leading the battle in her chariot and like wearing her husband's kind of cloak and helmet, and had these very kind of traditionally like masculine attributes. And I find that so fascinating, because also the Romans were such misogynists that it must have been so humiliating to them to be beaten by women.
Wow, I did not know that.
So that brings up a really interesting point. Like, I mean, like, so do you find that in a lot of the queens that you've written about, or kind of in other historical subjects that you've written about, is that these women need to perform masculinity in some way in order to hold and maintain power?
I think it's kind of split, that some women chose that route and other women chose to kind of be hyper feminine, traditionally feminine, and kind of work within that traditional skill set of kind of like negotiating behind the scenes, very Josephine like she would never be on the field of battle, but she was very good at these kind of like dinner table negotiation kinds of things. So, and I think either way you go, people are going to be misogynist against you.
Yeah, it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. That's like that. It's sort of like the worst and best part about being a woman, is that you can't really get it right.
Yeah.
So I think that's sort of what I enjoyed about Queens of Infamy, or reading about women in power in general, is that even though they have much more power than I will ever amass, you can deeply relate to them, and that no matter what they do, they're pissing somebody off. Okay.
There's a ton of questions here. Varsha, do you want to?
Yeah, and I'm trying to choose one. I'm trying to choose one.
I know. I mean, it's just one. Okay. All right. So I think how to phrase this. So I think that there's a lot of questions. First of all, I should note that there are a ton of Megan Follows fans out there, because she's the one who played. I feel like I should acknowledge that, because there's like 30 people who've written like she was the one in Rain, and playing it, and Anne of Green Gables, right? So, but I think another really interesting thread in a bunch of questions, I'm trying to synthesize this on the fly while having several drinks, so bear with me, is about kind of the kind of public facing nature of what you're doing, right? So it's not academic history, but it reaches this incredibly broad audience. Like, you're very incredibly active on Twitter. You have a large follower count and stuff like that. You have column at Long Reads and stuff like that. Like, how do you see that kind of functioning in kind of the understanding of the past, I guess, generally? Like, do you find that you get pushback for kind of the way that you write, or do you find that it's generally accepted? I mean, like has it been a good experience for you, I guess, if those cluster of questions make sense? So
yeah, for sure. I mean, I tend to think of myself as being like a history translator, that I'm not really like, I don't work with primary sources. I don't do like super cool research. I read texts that other people write, that maybe not everyone is reading, and I think what I'm good at is picking out the stuff that will be interesting and making it like funny and engaging. And it has been like a very positive experience. The historian community has been very welcoming of me, even though, as we've discussed, I have an academic background. I mean, there have been people who don't like it, which is fair. Like, not everything is for everyone. One guy wrote a really rude tweet. I'm trying to remember what he said. But he was like, this is like a Scholastic Junior reader with bonus F-bombs. And I was like, yeah, actually, I think that is what I'm trying to write, so.
I feel like that's what people need, though. Like, no one needs, like, I talk a lot about how I love a certain book, Nature's Metropolis, but like not every single person in America who needs to know about environmental history needs to read that, at least every single page of it, right? And so I think that's what is really cool about being, as you say, a history translator, is that sometimes that's what you need.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's, I mean, I think that's fundamentally it, right? Is that there's shit history and then there's good history, and it doesn't matter kind of where it comes. And there's some people who write a really great for them kind of monograph that 20 people are going to read, and they should do that if that's what they're really interested in. But that doesn't mean that's the only thing that can be done, and in fact, that shouldn't be the only thing that it can be done. I think that, as we've seen, at least in the American context, there's a debate about the 1619 project, which we've talked about on this, on the web, the webinar webcast, whatever this, not a podcast, that we're doing here, like many times, is, there's the really terrible kind of takes on American history, but that doesn't mean that, you don't have a PhD or do have a PhD, kind of to do those things. So
I think the key thing is, like, when you're writing about people in power, like you sort of do in Queens of Infamy, is not to underemphasize their flaws in their stories, but like to tell like a full picture of them, like not to focus so much on like the things that you would read in only like a short story, but like really try to get a full picture of the political stakes as well as like these social historical stakes, right? And I think that's why it's useful to read it in like this type of format instead of like a monograph or a giant biography, is because if you're reading like a giant biography or a monograph, you would maybe only focus on one aspect of the person, right? Like their political legacy, Josephine's political legacy. You wouldn't be deep into like, oh, what was she wearing this day, and like how does this affect the fact that like Napoleon decided not to leave her. I feel like that's just as important, because if Napoleon did leave her, you don't have half the story of Queen Josephine, right? So
yeah, for sure. And I was gonna say something interesting and now I can't remember what it was.
Just have another drink.
Oh,
that's what I'm gonna do. So it's like,
I want to make like the gateway drug for history, like the marijuana of history.
Can that be your new Twitter bio, please? I mean, I love your Twitter bio right now, which is, if I'm remembering right, is putting the hag in hagiographer, right?
Yeah.
So, but the marijuana of history, like, that's amazing.
That's definitely what as someone who is a grad student in history who isn't a professor yet, but as someone who's like spent a lot of time in history departments, that's definitely what the field needs. We need a marijuana of history, but not like, we don't need, like, to be honest, we really do not need the, I would say like the Peppermint Schnapps of history, which is like Bill O'Reilly's killing Lincoln. We don't need that. We need like genuine, like the marijuana of history, which is like actually good history that's based on facts, it's based on evidence, and that just lures you in because it's, 50% of it is like the hook and the fun stuff. Yeah, that's all I'm saying. That's how you should market yourself, because that's definitely what we need, and that answers everyone's questions about public-facing history. You have to like treat history as like, give part of it like a fix. Like, you gotta learn from The Wire, the economics of Stringer Bell. Sorry, I'm rambling at this point, but that's really good.
That's the most amazing metaphor I've ever heard, because like I picture Peppermint Schnapps and then it's like your racist uncle who's gonna tell some sort of joke that's really inappropriate after that. So yeah, no more of that. Like, more weed, less Peppermint Schnapps. And now I have to click the thing on YouTube when I post this that it's not for kids, because thank you. Yeah. I mean, I guess eventually we would have come here. Anyway.
Okay, any last remarks, Anne? I think this is the most drunk I've gotten on drunk historians. Oh, we didn't get to a lot of the questions. They were just so good, but like I think
there's just so many questions and they're so good.
Everyone is like in love with the fact that you study queens, which is I find really cool. So yeah. Yeah.
So can you give us a little? I guess my last question would be, and I don't want you to give anything away, but like, so who's your next subject going to be?
Boudica, which I don't even think I say her name right. So
that's amazing. We had like 5 questions about her. So this is a perfect segue to all of you who ask questions. Read Anne's next comment.
Yes.
Give long reads those sweet clicks. So, and we will be happy to. In fact, maybe afterwards, if you look on YouTube when we post this afterwards, I'll even put a link. I'll definitely put a link to Anne's amazing column of Queens of Infamy, because we are unfortunately out of time. So this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much, Anne, for joining us. This has been an incredible amount of fun, and I hope it's been a fun afternoon for everybody who's joined us this afternoon. So
thank you for putting up with my drunk rambling about Little Kings and Peppermint Schnapps. I'm sorry, I just really dislike Bill O'Reilly's attempts at history. They really frustrate me.
Who doesn't? Read Anne Thériault instead.
Yes.
That's right.
Read about
Bill O'Reilly.
And yeah. I can't wait to read about Joanna of Naples. I think I read it when it came out, and I haven't read it since, but she sounds like a badass. I cannot wait to reread that.
And apologies to all the Megan Follow stans.
They were very supportive. I mean, they were just really excited that somebody had talked about, Megan Follow. So anyway, on behalf of Varsha and myself, and thank you so much, Anne, for joining us. This was episode 10 of Drinking with Historians. We'll get this up on YouTube as soon as I sober up. But until then, please join us next week. I think we'll be back in the Middle Ages. I think our guest, if I'm remembering correctly, is Carl Shoemaker, who will be talking about the Middle Ages and law and things like that. He might tell us about his time defending Roy Moore as a lawyer, which was very interesting, but also about the time the devil was a lawyer. I think that those two things are connected, but I don't know. I'm not going to say anything. So, but until then, please join us next week. Have a great weekend. And until then, I'll just say cheers, everyone.
Cheers. Yeah. Thanks so much, guys.